In a recent LinkedIn post, I read 468 police recruits, more than 1,300 candidates placed into a police academy over several years. A hiring process that once took many months reduced dramatically. Those are real results. And when an organization takes an outdated process, challenges it, changes it, and can demonstrate the improvement with numbers, that deserves recognition. But I want to talk about what happens next, because getting people through the door is one system. What happens to them after they walk through it is another. And for police departments, public safety organizations, healthcare security departments, and the attorneys who eventually examine these organizations, that second system deserves serious attention. Let me put this plainly. You can recruit faster. You can hire better candidates. You can increase academy classes. You can solve vacancies. You can even modernize technology, improve background investigation. You can bring hundreds of people into an organization and still have another question waiting for you. What are you doing with them once they're yours? That's the briefing today. Because recruiting a capable person does not automatically produce a capable professional. Hiring doesn't do that. A badge doesn't do that. A uniform does not do that. A policy manual does not do that. And completing a police academy doesn't automatically tell us what someone will be capable of doing 6 months, 5 years, or 15 years later. People have to be developed, and that development happens inside a system. That's where I want officers to listen. That's where I want police executives to listen. That's where I want public safety and security leaders to listen. And that's where I especially want civil rights attorneys to listen, because these conversations are connected far more closely than they sometimes appear. The person you hire is only the starting point. Think about what happens after somebody enters a police organization. Someone decides what that person needs to learn. Someone decides how it will be taught. Who is qualified to teach it? Someone supervises the learning environment. Someone decides what happens when performance isn't where it should be. Someone determines what gets reinforced after graduation. Someone decides what officers receive during in-service training. Someone decides whether lessons learned in the field ever make their way back into education. And somebody has responsibility for the organization in which all of that occurs. That's not theory. That's everyday organizational life. And if you're a police officer, you should understand this, because your career does not develop in isolation. You may be the person making the decision on the street, but before you ever make that decision, an enormous number of organizational decisions have already been made around you. What you were taught, what you weren't taught, what was emphasized, barely discussed, what your instructors understood, what your supervisors reinforced, what your organization corrected, what it allowed to continue, what changed after previous incidents, what never changed at all. None of that automatically tells us whether an organization did something wrong. That's important. But it does tell us something else. The officer is not the only person in the story. And that's where this becomes particularly important. Because when something serious happens, everybody suddenly wants to understand the person at the end of the system. The police officer. What did you do? Why did you do it? What did you know? What were you thinking? Those questions belong in the conversation. But police praxis asks us not to stop there. Because sometimes the better question is, how did this organization prepare a human being to make that decision? Now we're talking about something very different, aren't we? For the officer listening, I want you to understand this before you ever need to understand it. Your education is part of your professional protection. I'm not talking about hiding behind training. I'm talking about becoming genuinely educated in your profession. Know your policy. Know the law that governs your work. Know your procedures. Know what you're actually been taught. Keep learning after mandatory training ends. Ask questions when something doesn't make sense. And don't assume that because somebody has more rank, more years, or a position at the front of a classroom, you no longer have a responsibility to understand what you're being taught. You do. You are the person who may eventually have to apply it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, without an instructor standing beside you, without a chief standing beside you, without an attorney standing beside you, and with seconds to decide. That is why police education should never be treated as something officers simply endure to satisfy a requirement. Your education follows you into the street. It follows you into supervision. It follows you into promotion. And sometimes it follows you into a courtroom. That should get every officer's attention. Because suddenly, training isn't something that the department gives you. It's part of your professional history. Now let's talk to the organization. If you're bringing more people through the door, that's an accomplishment. But growth places pressure on everything behind that door. More recruits mean more instruction, more instructors, more evaluation, more supervision, more field development, more people eventually entering in-service cycles, more future supervisors, more decisions being made under the organization's name. So when recruiting improves, the next executive question shouldn't only be, how many can we hire? It should also be, can the systems responsible for developing them keep pace? That's not criticism. That's responsible management. If you increase the number of people entering a profession, the systems responsible for preparing those people become even more important. And this isn't unique to policing. The organization may hire excellent people. Some may arrive with military experience, some with law enforcement experience, some with years in private security, some completely new to the environment. Wonderful. But these environments must understand that it is the responsibility to develop their people for the environment in which it expects them to perform. That's instructional systems. Without turning it into a classroom lecture, that's what we're talking about. The connection between what an organization expects their people to do and how it prepares them to do it. And attorneys, this is where I ask for your attention. When litigation begins, you inherit an event that has already happened. The video exists, the report exists, depositions begin, policies are produced, training records are requested, and eventually somebody says some version of, the employee was trained. Okay. But what does that actually tell you? Maybe quite a lot, maybe very little. A training record can establish that someone attended something. A curriculum can establish that material existed. A policy can establish that what the organization said should have happened. Those are important pieces of evidence. But none of them, standing alone, necessarily tells us the complete story of how people were actually prepared. And this is where I want to be careful. I'm not giving attorneys a legal conclusion. That's your profession. I'm talking about the organization behind the records. Because a document and a functioning system are not necessarily the same thing. That's an important distinction. A course can exist. The harder question is what occurred in it. A policy can exist. The harder question is how it was understood. An instructor can be assigned. The harder question is what the organization expected from that instructor. Training can be completed. The harder question is what the organization learned from performance afterwards. Those are factual and organizational questions, and depending on the case, some may lead nowhere. That's fine. Good inquiry isn't about forcing a theory. It's about finding out what actually happened. But when a case genuinely raises questions about municipal policy, custom, supervision, or failure to train, the organizational picture can become important. Monell litigation is not simply a matter of proving that an employee made a bad decision and then assigning that decision to the municipality. The standards are considerably more demanding than that. A failure to train theory, for example, involves questions that you already know, deliberate indifference, and whether the identified deficiency was sufficiently connected to the constitutional injury. Those are legal questions for attorneys in courts, but underneath those legal questions are often factual ones. What did the organization actually do? That's where instructional systems can become relevant, not because every training imperfection creates constitutional liability. It doesn't. Not because better training automatically proves failure to train. It doesn't. And not because every bad outcome means the system caused it. It doesn't. The point is narrower and stronger. If training becomes important to the theory of a case, understand the training system before deciding what the training records mean. That is a different level of inquiry. There's another side to this, and officers should hear it too. A serious examination of the training system can protect officers as much as it can scrutinize organizations. Suppose an officer is criticized for a decision. What exactly had the organization prepared that officer to do? What guidance existed at the time? What instruction had actually been provided? Was the officer acting contrary to what the organization developed? Or was the officer doing substantially what the organization had prepared people to do? Those are very different factual pictures. That's why I resist conversations where quote-unquote training automatically becomes synonymous with blaming the department. It shouldn't. A functioning instructional system may demonstrate that an organization took preparation seriously. It may show thoughtful instruction. It may show adaptation. It may show that the employee departed from clear preparation. Or examination may reveal questions that deserve further attention. Follow the evidence. That's the point. Executives, there's something here for you too. You don't have to wait for litigation to learn about your organization. In fact, that's probably the worst time to begin. You already have information. Recruit performance, field performance, supervisor observations, complaints, after action reviews, policy changes, use of force reviews, instructor observations, legal development, changes in the communities, new technologies, new operational demands. The question is whether those sources ever speak to one another. Because an organization can collect enormous amounts of information and still fail to learn from it. That is where leadership becomes practical. When something changes in the field, does education hear about it? When education identifies a recurring problem, does command hear about it? When supervisors see a pattern, can that information travel back to the people responsible for development? When an executive returns from a nationally recognized leadership program, does the learning stay with the executive or does something inside the organization improve? These are not complicated questions, but they require somebody to ask them. And now we come back to where we started. Recruitment. 468 recruits, a dramatically faster process. More people entering the profession. That's something an organization can measure, and measurable improvement is worth recognizing. But here's where I think that success creates another opportunity. Those police recruits aren't numbers anymore. They're people. They'll become police officers. Some will become investigators, some instructors, some corporals, some detectives, some sergeants, lieutenants, captains, maybe someday chiefs. And long after everyone has forgotten how quickly their applications were processed, they will still be carrying what the organization taught them. That's the part we cannot afford to overlook. Recruitment gets people through the door. Development determines much of what happens after they enter it. And for attorneys, if you're examining what happened at the end of someone's professional development, don't automatically assume you understand everything that happened at the beginning or in the years in between. For executives, if you're proud of what you're hiring, be equally serious about who you're developing. For instructors, never forget that person sitting in your classroom may someday make the most consequential decision of their career using something you helped them understand. And for officers, take ownership of your education. Know what you're being taught. Know why. Keep learning. Ask questions, because ultimately you may be the person expected to act. But you should never forget, you were developed inside an organization before the organization ever asked you to perform for it. That's why this conversation belongs in police academies. It belongs in command meetings. It belongs in city government. And when the facts support it, it belongs in the questions attorneys ask about how organizations actually prepare human beings to exercise authority. Getting people through the door is important. What happens after they walk through it can shape a career, an organization, a lawsuit, and sometimes a life. I'm Tom Loglisci. Thank you for listening to Police Praxis Audio Briefings.